Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our event today that focuses on China's macro structural developments, policies, both as it relates to the short term and the medium term. I'm Alfred SCHIPKE, the director of the East Asian Institute here at the National University of Singapore, and I'm joined today by my colleagues, Professor Yiping, who is the Dean at the National School of Development at Peking University, and my colleague, Dr. Gurkai, who is the Executive President of the CF40 Institute and is also a senior fellow here at the Institute. Today's event is on the record, and we will release a note both in English and in Chinese at the end of the event. We'll put it in the chat box that supports our discussions somewhat. What we thought we'll do is we will start out with a presentation. We'll start out with a presentation that is in three parts, and then have ample of time for Q&A, and I'll come to the procedure when we get to that particular point. So with that, let me get started. And again, welcome everybody here in Asia for our event on China's economic trajectory. We'll divide the presentation into three parts. The first part is more on the conjunctural current macroeconomic developments and policies, which will be presented by Gurkai. Then we have kind of linking the short term with the medium term drivers of macro cycles and also related to policy, which Yiping will cover. And then we'll get to the third part that is a little bit more structural and medium term, that focuses on how to move toward consumption-driven growth model and some financial sector issues. But with that, let me invite Gurkai to start out.
Thank you, Alfred. It's a great pleasure to join all of you today to discuss China's economy. I'm going to cover really the short-term stuff, just to understand what happened in 2024 and what's going to our outlook on China's economy in 2025. Can we go to the first slide? To understand how China's economy is doing this year, we really need to look back on to 2024. What happened last year? What happened last year was really interesting. I think in the first 9 months, what happened was that China was under quite a lot of pressure. The economy had a lot of pressure because mainly two things. One is that the housing market continued to slow down quite significantly. Another thing is that fiscal spending, because of about a set of policies, that fiscal spending is slowing down also quite dramatically. So both the housing market and the fiscal spending was slowing down. So that makes the first 9 months the economy is growing, really facing a lot of headwinds. That's actually eventually prompted the government to do something at the beginning of September. We had a September political bureau meeting, which wrote a bunch of policies that try to address the short-term issue. Most notably, I think that's on the fiscal front. One is that they wrote a massive package to help local government to address their local government debt issue. I mean, altogether, it probably amount to 12 trillion renminbi. Also, I think they wrote additional spending, both in at end of last year, also earlier this year. So we had a quite big fiscal stimulus since the fourth quarter of 2024. That helped to stabilize the growth of Chinese economy and also carried into this year. Next slide. besides fiscal, I think the PBOC also did quite a bit of easing. Cumulatively, I think the benchmark rates were lowered by 30 basis points. One in Q4 last year, one in Q2 this year. Also, they lowered the required reserve ratio by 1 percentage point. So the liquidity in the banking system is quite abundant. Because of both the fiscal stimulus and the monetary easing, headline GDP started to rebound in Q4 last year. It was 5.4% year on year. Nominally, the growth was lower. It's 4.6. Next slide. So in the first quarter of this year, the policy support continued, which means the Q1 of this year, the economy is performing quite strongly. Real growth is still 5.4%, and although the nominal GDP growth is lower at still 4.6%, there are two additional things happening at the earlier this year. One is there was some nascent sign of that the housing market is stabilizing, particularly at top cities. If you look at housing sales, it is still negative, but it is declining at a much slower pace compared to past 3 years. So the housing market become a less drag on the Chinese economy compared to past several years. Another good sign was this roundtable our president had with private entrepreneur and the DeepSeek, which were become a sensation in earlier this year. All of those actually boost the sentiment in the market, also in the economy quite a bit, which promised a lot of enthusiasm in terms of investment, private sector investment into the tech space. So the fiscal stimulus, monetary easing, improvement of sentiment, plus some initial signs of stabilization of property market, all make China's economy is doing reasonably well in Q1 this year. Next. But since start to change, I think in early April, I mean, everybody got this Liberation Day shock of U.S. tariffs. China, no exception. Actually, China were at one time subject to the highest tariff among all the countries. To go up all the way up to 145% additional tariff. The tariff had really curious impact on China's economy. On the trade front, I mean, you see the expected outcome that China's export to U.S. Start to drop quite significantly since April. But China's export to other regions, particularly to Southeast Asia, soared at the same time. So overall, China's export performed reasonably well so far this year. It's still in positive territory compared to last year. Some of them are due to probably rerouting of trade through Southeast Asia, but some of them is really continued, I think, demand, strong demand from many parts of the world. So the impact of tariff are not, I mean, and some of them are due to front running of exporters. They just try to ship a lot of stuff out of China before the tariff hit. So far the tariff impact on China doesn't really show up yet on export overall export figure. But the impact of the tariff is mostly through actually uncertainty and the confidence of the private sector. Next slide. If you look at private demand for capital, for credit, if you look at corporate borrowing, if you look at loans to enterprises, it started to slow down quite significantly since April. And if you look at those high frequency indicator like PMI, like price data, PPI, CPI, all those figures start to weaken since April, which I took as a sign that private sector when faced with uncertainty, they stopped investment, they stopped doing expansion. They are taking a wait and see attitude. That become a make the momentum of economic recovery less robust. On top of that, some of the more entrenched issue start to re-emerge again. You know, one most important issue is really like, if you look at price data, I mean, the most recent reading of China's PPI was minus 3.6%. If you look at China's GDP deflator, it has been negative for 8 quarters already, longest on Chinese history. So this deflation pressure started to increase, which also increased the real interest rate, which become a drag on demand on credit expansion. Still, I mean, all those negative feedback loops start to strengthen itself. So we still see quite a visible sign that economy is losing some momentum entering the second quarter. Next. So what should China do right now? Our view is that you know, given the external shock caused by the U.S. tariff, we probably should have some macro policies to offset that shock. You know, by our estimates, CF40 estimate, and many estimates by different institutions, a 20 to 30% additional tariff on China would mean that we're going to be about 1% to 1.5% of GDP shock to China's growth. So you probably want to offset that shock by rolling out some additional fiscal measures. I mean, that translates into about 1 to 1.5 trillion renminbi new fiscal package. I mean, that 1 to 1.5 trillion is on a 12-month basis. So essentially, you want to spend additional 1 to 1.5 trillion renminbi in the next 12 months to offset the additional shock because of U.S. tariffs. Hopefully, that spending will be targeted towards households, towards consumption, so that it could both help to boost consumption domestically, also to help address some of the concerns voiced by China's trading partners, like the EU, like some Southeast Asia countries. They are concerned China are shipping too much goods to their economy, or export deflation to their economy. If you try to do more stimulus on consumption, that would help alleviate those concerns. You know, in addition to fiscal policy, although we believe fiscal policy probably is the most important lever the Chinese government should pull right now, the additional monetary policy easing probably is also warranted given the low inflation environment. We think LPR could be further lowered if needed. At the end of the day, I think if you're looking to the next several quarters, China's economy really depends on a few things. Two major things. One is how the China-US trade negotiation would go. I mean, there are some signs that the two parties are coming to a truce. There may be even further cut on tariff from both sides, which I think would help reduce some uncertainty on the trade front. Although I think if you look longer term, the U.S.-China trade relationship will continue to be very, very difficult. Another major factor affecting the next several quarters is really whether the Chinese government can roll out some additional support to the economy quickly and forcefully. I think it will help address the slowing momentum we see in recent data. Of course, I know there need to be a lot of structural policies, structural reform to be rolled out. Also, I guess Professor Huang and Professor SCHIPKE will cover that part. I'll stop here and pass on to Professor Huang.
Thank you. As Alfred indicated early on, what I like to do is to share with you some of my recent analysis. Hopefully, it will provide a bridge connecting what Guoke just outlined on the macro front, and then the structure issues that Alfred will discuss later on. Can we turn the slides? This chart just shows the result of summary result of an analysis I did recently. The basic question is this: when the economy moved around, when you see the macroeconomic cycles, we always look at these economic indicators at the aggregate level. So we think about GDP, income, employment, production, consumption, and so on. One question we raised, and we somehow always sensed that whenever the economy moved up and down, sometimes you sense that there were some specific sectors behind, or some specific sectors made disproportionate contributions to the movement. As Gorka hinted early on, one of the reasons why we are seeing a weakness of the economy is the sluggish the property sector. So the question we raised for this research is, when we see the macroeconomic cycles, were there specific leading sectors playing a bigger role than the other sectors in the movement of the macroeconomy? And so we used this production network approach and divided the Chinese economy into 17 sectors, trying to figure out, when the economy moves, which sector at a particular point of time were making bigger contributions. The general takeaway or the finding was that obviously these key industries we could detect, but the general direction was, in the early stage of economic reform, the key industries driving around the macroeconomic cycle were labor-intensive industries. More recently, the capital-intensive industries became more important. And what we found summarized in this chart is, I thought, was quite interesting. Basically, after the global financial crisis, that one sector made a very big contribution to the macroeconomic cycle was called construction and property. And so, for instance, you find after the global financial crisis, our economy went up quite quickly, and you probably all heard about the 4 trillion yuan stimulus package announced at the end of 2008, and the economy started to move up in 2009. But look back, the economy recovered very quickly, but it was really mainly driven by the upturn or the booming of construction plus property. And I'm sure you all know the infrastructure was a big story. If you also look at some other sectors around that time, even when the economy recovered very drastically, some of the sectors are still on the way down. So you can find out of the 17 industries we looked at, that one particular sector, construction and property, made a very big contribution to the recovery of economic growth. And then you look at the latest cycle, when the economy started to cool down during the past years. Again, that was also still driven by construction and property. This time around, the property sector made a bigger contribution. You look at some of the gray lines on the chart, you also see some sectors actually moving up. And that's more related to the high-end manufacturing and so on. But they were not significant enough in turn up the macroeconomy. So I guess from this very simple exercise, what we trying to take away from to understand the current situation, there are two things. Number one, if one sector or a couple of sectors were pushing around the macroeconomic cycles, then if we try to stabilize economic growth, we needed to pay attention to the condition of these sectors. So I think a direct outcome of that analysis is that if we really want to stabilize growth, and I agree with Guokai on all suggestions he made, I think one particular point I want to highlight from the analysis of this study is that stabilization of the property sector is still very crucial. Even though we already start to see early signs of stabilization, which is very good. But if tumbling of the property sector continues, then it's very difficult for growth to stabilize. That's why I think some additional attention, at least to that sector, is very useful. The second implication, which is also relevant, is, well, if the construction and the property sector were very important drivers of growth in the past 10, 15 years, and I think chances are that even if the property sector can be stabilized, it's unlikely to drive growth as a major contributor to economic growth in the next stage of development. Then the next question is, which industries will drive the Chinese economic growth going forward? So this is what I mentioned. There is probably a sectorial story when we think about economic growth, both in the short term and in the long run. In order for growth to continue at a sustained pace, we need to be able to develop and some new industries that can take over the driving seat. Like as I mentioned earlier on, the labor-intensive industries play a very big role, and then the capital-intensive industries took over. Last 10, 15 years, construction and the property sector were very important. The question is, what will be the new industries going forward? Now, obviously, this is why we always argue that the Chinese growth model now have to rely on innovation-driven growth. Innovation, formation of new industries becomes very important. So this is why sectorial part of the story is also very important. Can we turn to the next slide? And this is what I like to connect, also to connect what Guokai discussed about the macro policy, and Alfred will discuss about the structural policy. This chart was borrowed from a report prepared by Professor Xiong Wei of Princeton University and his co-authors. Basically, there are two lines on the chart. The red line shows the actual GDP growth of from 2000, and the blue line shows the growth target set by the government at the beginning of the year. There was you probably can see a turning point around 2012. Before that, the growth target was almost routinely set at around 8%, and the actual outcome was above that. After that, you see the growth target gradually moving down. The actual growth rate was also moving down gradually. And I think one possible explanation of this change is, obviously we can say, well, maybe the growth potential is coming down as the Chinese economy is becoming more developed. But at the same time, you also find, well, before 2012, the economy always can achieve the target quite comfortably. In fact, the actual growth rate was much higher than the target set at the beginning of the year. But now the two numbers actually move very closely together. And one possibility is that the entire economy or participants of the market will all try making serious efforts in delivering growth. And this is probably why also the property sector and the construction were playing a very big role. My guess is that all levels of government, once the annual target of growth was set, and they worked very hard to deliver that growth. So growth rate, the target was always met at the end of the year. The problem is that we focus too much on short-term growth performance, and we rely too much on near-term tools like construction and also the property sector. What we're seeing is the total factor productivity is not actually improving, and most studies show deterioration of the total factor productivity. That, I think, is probably something we need to keep in mind, that if we focus too much on the near-term growth, especially on using the traditional sectors like construction and property, it probably will affect our ability to inform the new industries, competitive industries. And so that leads to my next slides, and I just like to highlight, if growth stabilization is the goal and we want to achieve, I think we probably need a package of the policies to think about. The macroeconomic policies are very important, as Guokai highlighted earlier. If the economy is weakening, then the fiscal monetary policy should play an important role in stabilizing growth. At the same time, however, we need to look at the potential consequence, look at the competitiveness of the industries, because certain industries will still carry the main burden of driving Chinese growth. The question is, can we continuously form and develop new industries? And that's why I think to some extent, policies supporting the formation of new industries will also be very important. Finally, obviously, I mean, I will stop there just by saying that structural reforms are also very important, because that would improve, on the one hand, the efficiency of resource allocation, and on the other hand, probably boosting the confidence of market participants. And these are, at the end of the day, were the key sources of productivity growth. So I'll stop here, Alfred.
Thank you very much, Yiping and Guokai. I want to connect directly to where Yiping left off and ask the question of what is needed to move toward this consumption-driven growth model, and somewhat related to that, the financial sector, in particular, the banking sector. But let me first kind of connect the short term with the structural policies. I think it is very important that both are done in tandem and supporting each other. We have seen public debt levels increase significantly. When we look at the central government debt to GDP ratio, which is about 29%, it is relatively low. But if you add on top of that local governments, we get to about 70% of GDP. And if you then add local government financing vehicles on top of that, you're ending up with about 124% of GDP. So not low anymore. But in our view, despite higher public debt levels, given China's still high savings rate, the fact that it has a relatively close capital count, and it still has quite a number of public assets. So China's balance sheet, public sector balance sheet, is still relatively resilient, even though it is not as resilient as it was a decade ago. What that means is that we believe that right now there is the fiscal space to increase support to the economy. We're advocating, as Kai said, 1 to 1.5 trillion over the next 12 months. Maybe I should highlight that in our view, the best would be to put this on the balance sheet of the central government, not of the local governments. The local governments, and I'll come to that in a second, are already faced with relatively high debt levels. So that is kind of the short term, providing additional support to ensure two things. First of all, this move from the traditional growth model that, as Yiping highlighted, relied on construction, investment, and the real estate sector. That move toward a new growth model ultimately has transitory costs, and to ensure that does not unduly undermine confidence, it is important to contribute additional support. And of course, China, as many other countries, is confronted with the external shocks, largely coming from tariffs, and including the uncertainty around tariffs, and that warrants support as well. So a strong argument for additional support. The government has the balance sheet to do it. Having said that, though, moving toward a more consumption-based growth model will make the argument requires an important fiscal reform. But before I get that, maybe just a few words on, how do we interpret the government's intention? In our view, moving toward a consumption-driven, private consumption-driven growth model is almost a panacea. First of all, it helps rebalancing the economy. And of course, also, it then implies, as Kai indicated earlier, less reliance on export demand. Now, these statements somewhat have been reflected at various levels of the leadership and government. Last year's third plenary session, for example, highlighted the need toward moving to a more consumption-driven model. And then more recently, Premier Li's speech at the Summer Davos in Tianjin again mentioned it as an important factor. Now, one thing is the recognition of that is the direction of policies in general, but how do we get there? Now, a lot has been written on what is required for China to reduce precautionary savings. And that's for citizens that have concerns about the future. And when you have concerns about the future, you're increasing savings. Now, the literature, a lot of our colleagues have said, well, there are three things: more spending on health, education, and ultimately the pension reform, and potentially additional resources that need to go into this. This is all very, very important. But in our view, the preconditions for that is three things. First of all, a major fiscal reform, and I'll come to that. The second part, and maybe most Western and those who don't follow China so carefully, has to do with the role of local governments. The old model, the old growth model, and we'll talk a little bit about that, relied very much on local governments. And that needs to change for a number of reasons. So the role of local governments and that of local government officials have to change. And that somewhat is also related to redefining the relationship between local governments and the central government, which we in the West sometimes call as fiscal federalism. Now, I don't have to tell you, anybody who has ever been involved in structural reforms, these are all extremely difficult reforms to implement. There are political dimensions because there are winners and losers, and there are even on the administrative side, relatively difficult to do. But let me go through them one by one. So when it comes to China's fiscal overall, China had a major fiscal reform in 1994, and then some budget amendments in 2015, which were, however, only partly implemented. But why are we arguing for a large fiscal reform and basically a tax reform or revenue boosting reform? It has to do with the level of revenues that the government receives. In this figure, you have two colors. Let's focus on is it red or orange? Maybe first. This shows the tax to GDP ratio, the revenue rate, tax revenue ratio And you can see that in 2012, it was 18.3%. It's estimated to be down to 12.5%. That is a humongous fall, and the reason of it is multifold. Some tax exemptions, the buoyancy of the revenues are different, but again, coming back to changing the growth model and basically having more spending for education and health, and ultimately also the social safety net, including social security, requires additional resources. As a matter of fact, if you look at China's spending on those, they're extremely low compared to peers globally, OECD countries, but also maybe closer to home, Korea and Japan. So the need to raise revenues is important, because otherwise spending on these important categories to boost confidence, to reduce precautionary savings will be difficult. And of course, it will also then address more medium-term fiscal sustainability issue. Now, is that feasible? What are the issues here? And if you look at the tax structure, China is really an outlier among many. Maybe just to highlight one of them, and that is that China relies very much on indirect taxes. The personal income tax, for example, only generates 1% of GDP, or close to 1% of GDP. Now, that is extremely low. Only about, well, less than 10% of the people in the workforce ultimately pay an income tax. So if you compare that to OECD or maybe other countries in the region, that is extremely low. So broaden the personal income tax base is very important. And then, of course, other areas, including simplifying the VAT and reduce exemptions, a lot of exemptions that the system has. So a major tax reform. My colleague, Christine Wong, is going to publish, we're going to have the reference at the end, a paper relatively soon that will spell out the details of this. But in the absence of this, I think it would be very difficult to do all this stuff as it relates to healthcare, education, and social security spending. But that by itself is not enough. And again, this is probably very unique for China, but it's very important to keep in mind that China's economic model, the old model that Huang Yiping alluded to before, was driven by local governments, not the central government. Local governments were accounting for 80% of public investments. In China, they were even responsible for a anti-cyclical fiscal policy. It was not even the central government, it was the local governments. They were the source of innovation, opening up, and the direct allocation of resources. China has 9 levels of government. So when we talk about local governments here, it is in addition to the provinces, you have lower levels of government as well. Now, why is this not going to go? Why is it not possible that this can continue? One is that local governments in the past, especially over the last 10 years, relied on debt financing to finance their activities, including public investment. Now, a number of local governments, provinces, and some of them are larger than the size in terms of population than Germany, for example. So these could be countries in other parts of the world. They have debt levels of 150% of GDP. For anybody who's interested in this, this is actually similar to the debt levels during the Euro crisis in 2010, when you had a country like Greece, for example, having debt levels of 150% of GDP. So the ability of local governments to continue to rely on debt financing to finance their activities is more limited going forward. The other part, and this is the figure here that I wanted to highlight, and maybe in particular the red line, is the fact that local governments relied on the sale of land. So maybe one can think of this as privatization, selling land and then getting receipts from that. In 2021, the gross receipt from this, these are not net receipts, but just to give you magnitude, were 8.4% of GDP. Now, last year, those were 3.8% of GDP. So the gap is humongous. And as Juan Yiping highlighted, going forward, real estate in China will probably play less of a role, which also means that in equilibrium going forward, local governments will have a tougher time relying on land sales for receipts. So two key sources of financing in the past, debt and the sale of land going forward, will be more limited. But that means that many of the activities that local governments undertook will be difficult to continue doing going forward. So that now really speaks to the role of local governments in this new environment. In our view, it should be shifting away from the direct allocation of resources, more creating the environment for businesses to flourish, and then, of course, provide public services. In the Chinese context, though, and this is important to highlight, this is going to be extremely difficult to do because in the past, local government officials had what we call KPIs, performance criteria, that were linked to generating economic growth, improving public infrastructure. So those KPIs now have to be changed and maybe speak more to issues of maybe contributing to increases in rural income, improvement in education and health services, instead of public investment in GDP. But you can imagine that this is a major change, and you probably won't be able to do it overnight. It will take time, but it will be critical combined with that broader fiscal reform that I talked about to move toward this consumption-driven growth model. Or to put it differently, this is part of the reason why it has been so difficult to get away from the focus on investment, where still local government officials are focusing on investment up until today. And somewhat related to that is the fact that local governments have all of the responsibilities in terms of expenditure, but really don't have the resources in terms of their own revenues to do it. This figure shows the gap between the revenues and expenditures, and that has to be filled by, in the past, land sales and maybe debt. So it requires a major reform that, as I indicated earlier, in the West we call fiscal federalism. And in our view, certain responsibilities should be transferred from local governments to the central government, including that of anti-cyclical policy that should be done on the balance sheet of the central government. But even other social functions as it relates to pension and unemployment, shifting it to the central government. Now, again, as anybody who has done a little bit on political economy, on fiscal federalism reform in the West, these are not easy things to do, but critically important to do. It is fair, though, to say that last year's third plenum actually speaks to this, that there has to be a reallocation of responsibilities. The key now is to implement it, and we're somewhat hopeful that maybe the next 5-year plan that will come out next year would speak to this. Now, let me shift to another part that, of course, always warrants attention, and that is the financial sector. Now, here I want to focus on the banking sector because the banking sector is important on two fronts. First of all, the stability of the sector, but the second part more related to this new growth model, and that is allocating resources effectively to the right part of the economy. When it comes to China's largest banks, in our view, and the IMF just completed or published its 2024 FSUP in April, is the large banking sector is well capitalized, it is liquid, and it's resilient to shocks. So that's the good news. Of course, because of the challenges of the property sector, the difficulties that local governments have, there is pressure on the banking sector, especially as it relates to smaller banks. Now, with the policies that the government rolled out, the ones that Gurkai were alluding to last year, the government addressed some of those, at least these short-term pressures. But it's still important to continue cleaning up the balance sheets of those institutions, restructuring, because ultimately that is required to allocate the resources to the more productive part of the economy. Now, having said that, there is a part of the banking sector that warrants closer attention, and that is more recent, that we wanted to flag, and it's actually lending to small and medium enterprise. It sounds kind of weird that is the focus of our discussion here, but I think you will quickly understand that it's really an area that warrants attention, and that has both short and medium-term implications. So if we look at lending to small and medium enterprises, which in a certain kind of way, maybe the problem is that the Chinese government has been too successful, because in the past, it has been encouraging the banking sector to lend to small and medium enterprises. As you all know, small and medium enterprises usually, or I should say small and micro enterprises in the case of China, they have difficulties in getting financing. And of course, there's a whole range of literature on this. So the government wanted to ensure that there is enough financing. But that sector accounts for the largest part. This figure here shows the entire banking sector, and the share of the loans to SMEs is now about 37%, and therefore is the largest share. It's bigger than the exposure, for example, that the banking sector has to local government financing vehicles and to the real estate sector. And to highlight why this has become an issue is both the size of it and it's the rapid increase. Last year, more than 60% of all new lending went to small and SMEs. And on top of that, because of policies, it is at interest rates that probably do not fully reflect risks, and therefore can ultimately lead to difficulties. And that is contributing to what we call the NIM compression that is an issue right now in China. Now, we don't have detailed information on NPLs of these SMEs, but there is one Dalian RC bank that, for example, shows that the NPLs to that part accounted for 27% as opposed to 3% for the rest. So a major part, because the pricing of these loans and the speed of which this has been increased could ultimately imply that the resources don't go to the part that ultimately need the resources as we're moving toward an innovation driven economy. Another one is a question about the asset quality. If you look at non-performing loans, it's actually at an all-time, a non-performing loan ratio is at an all-time low. But that might be somewhat misleading because 38% of the loans are still under a loan moratorium that came into effect because of COVID. As a matter of fact, China is probably one of the longest loan moratorium, anywhere in the world. And we know from other countries' experiences, when you come out of this moratorium, then you'll find out that the asset quality is very different than what you had before. So this moratorium has been extended formally until the end of the year. And of course, there are now the issues to ensure, as one comes out of this moratorium, to do this in a way that is not disruptive. But critically important, again, is to ensure a cleanup of the balance sheet so that the credit can go to the most productive of the economy. So let me maybe summarize some of the points, and I'll then pass on again for a few takeaways again to Guokai and Yiping. We do see that short-term near growth, probably for the first half of the year, will be in excess of 5%. So maybe that's good news. But some of the more recent high-frequency data suggests that there are quite a bit of weaknesses that ultimately, in our view, requires support to the economy. The government has the balance sheet, in our view, to do that, and a package of about 1 to 1.5 trillion over the next 12 months on the balance sheet of the central government would be a way to deal with this, and of course, partly related to the headwinds that comes from the external shocks. Given the downward pressure on prices, Guokai mentioned the GDP deflator. There is probably room for additional monetary policy support as well. And as part of this process, especially as China is confronted with external shocks, to ensure that there is some degree of exchange rate flexibility. In our view, both for China and by extension, I think for the rest of the world, this emphasis on moving toward a consumption-led growth model is truly the panacea. It would also take away some of the pressure in terms of reliance on exports. How do you get about this? Ultimately, you need to reduce precautionary savings, strengthening social safety nets. But these have three important components. One is a major fiscal reform to increase the revenue to GDP ratio. Of course, one can also look at expenditure and so on and so forth. But the key here is on the revenue side, there is significant room, especially as it relates to the personal income tax, which is a complete outlier. And then you have this other issue, equally important, and that is the role of local governments that will not be able to contribute to growth as they did in the past, and therefore don't have the financing, and instead should create the conditions for the private sector and other actors in the economy to grow, and of course provide the social services. But that requires a change in the KPI for local government officials and a reorganization of the relationship of the central to local governments. And lastly, as it relates to the banking sector, just to highlight again, the largest banks are in very, very good shape, able to withstand, but smaller banks do face some difficulties. And there is now this part of the loan book that has been grown rapidly. More than 60% of all new loans last year went to the sector. that needs to be addressed and priced based on the risk that the sector has. And ultimately, getting out of this loan moratorium and then cleaning up the balance sheet will be critical. Maybe I'll start out. Gokul, did you want to maybe add your thoughts?
I mean, you summarized very well. I just going to add 2 points. One is that, you know, yes, the first half of this year, China's growth will be comfortably above 5%. The annual target of growth is 5%. So the measure we are recommending is really about, there's some indication that the economy is slowing down in recent months. So we need to do something to offset the shock from US tariffs. A second point I want to make is, you know, there is a lot of debate, at least internally in China, not internally, within China, that which is more important, whether it's macro policy or structural reforms. I think by our analysis, I think actually at this stage of development, China needs to do both. You know, you cannot rely on only one thing. Either do, it's not like a one or other choice. It has to be both to sustain both in terms of short-term growth, also more medium to longer term sustainable growth. I'm going to stop here and pass on to Professor Huang.
I also like to add one point related to what Alfred mentioned earlier about the central-local government relations. And obviously, there are lots of things you have to change. But the point I was talking about, the local government tried very hard to boost the growth, but primarily through construction and property, which was useful to some extent. But over time, I think the marginal returns is declining. The question I think now is the point Alfred also mentioned, that in addition to realign the fiscal relation between central and the local government, the change of local government behavior in economic activity is also very important. At the very beginning of economic reform, one policy that really contributed to the economic growth was what we call the decentralization, the decision power moving down from the center to the local level, which was tremendously helpful for boosting economic growth, because the local authorities had more freedom and motivation, incentives to drive growth. But I think we probably have reached a point that the local government probably should withdraw from some of the direct involvement in economic activities, as the third plenum of the 20th Party Congress clearly articulated that the goal of reform is for the market to play decisive roles in allocating resources. So decentralization was useful, but it's not a replacement or substitute of a market-oriented reform. And this might be a good time or timing for the local government to give up some of the economic responsibilities, focus more on the public goods responsibility. That to some extent might also reduce the gap between its spending responsibility and the fiscal revenues. I'll stop here, Alfred.
Thank you very much. With that, I think we can come to the next part of the event, and that is the Q&A. I think we have already received a number of questions in the chat box. I will go through them in a second, but I also wanted to invite 3 of my colleagues to show themselves for a second, who have been contributing to the background work. And again, there will be a number of background papers that will be published soon. We have Jason Bedford, who is with us. Jason, maybe you could just quickly show yourself. Then we have Christine Wong, who is here with us as well. And then we have Bo Chen Bo, who very much focuses on trade-related issues. But let me get to the Q&A in the chat. I have to bring it up here on my screen, so please be patient for a second. And I think maybe we'll go in order. I think it is a little bit in line with the presentation also. So the first question by Ashima Tayagi. Maybe what I'll do is, Ashima, do you just want to come in and maybe raise the question yourself? I think we can try to emulate as if we were all in the same room.
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me? Thank you so much for the presentation, and really enjoyed the crisp points that you made. So I was again very curious to understand, are we expecting a strong stimulus package this year as well? And what is the timing that you're expecting? I know nobody would have you know, a crystal ball on that, but do you have a sense of when that might come in? Usually it's around the end of the year to lift the growth targets, but any insights on that would be great. Thank you.
Now, who wants to answer and give us the crystal ball on this one? I think both Kai and Yiping. Yiping, did you want to come in?
I think it should be Guokai.
Okay, I'll try. I don't have a crystal ball, but you know, my sense is that given the strength of spending so far this year, fiscal spending so far this year, and given the budget already being the allocated spending for the whole year, there will have to be some additional fiscal package this year. Otherwise, I guess we're going to have not enough money to spend towards the end of the year. But given so far up until second quarter, the growth number looks pretty strong. I guess there will be some. The consensus will need to be reached, I guess, towards the fourth quarter, later part of this year. So my best guess is that there will be some additional fiscal package in fourth quarter this year. It may not be as massive as last year's, because last year's is really a big package. But we probably should be expecting some additional fiscal support in Q4.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. The next one, Yulen Yang.
Hi, Professor SCHIPKE and everyone. Thank you very much. Just doing the proportionate math, right? If it was 4 trillion of RMB stimulus back in 2008 on a 30 trillion GDP at that time, it's about 13%. GDP now is about 130 trillion plus. Proportionate would be 17 trillion stimulus. Obviously, that's a very big number. But what would be an appropriate amount or proportion of stimulus in today's economy? Thank you.
Kai, I think since you started articulating the number.
You know, let me try to answer this. I mean, the way I thought about this, you know, I don't think we need to do anything that to return China's growth to pre-COVID trend or pre the housing adjustment trend. I think that would be unrealistic. So I think it's probably a wrong comparison comparing to what China did in 2008 and what China should be doing right now. I think for now, I think China probably is just stabilizing its economy in a post housing boom era. That means medium to high growth rate. So in that sense, I don't see we need to do that kind of massive stimulus comparing to 2008. The figure we put into the note is really to think about, given China's growth target is 5%, given the economy looks okay before the tariff shock, and given our rough estimate of how the tariff would impact China's growth, what's the additional fiscal package would be needed to offset that shock? So we are now thinking about the 2008 type of stimulus. We are really thinking about stabilizing short-term growth to offset the tariff shock. Then on top of that, some structural reforms to keep China growth in a more sustainable path in the medium to long term. That's my response. I don't know whether two of you have any additional comments.
I will just add, I completely agree. I don't think the government or most people in China have the appetite to repeat what happened in 2008. In fact, during the past years, there were lots of discussions about whether or not that package might be a bit overdone or too long or and so on. So I think what Guoke said was exactly right. The point I want to add is that since you look at the data Guoke showed early on, I think what he said, which I also agreed to, was on the one hand, the headline growth numbers would look okay, even if the second quarter GDP numbers are coming out. Then at the same time, if you look at some of the indicators like PMI, like private sector investment and migrant workers unemployment rate and so on, show some weakness. To us, that really show probably the confidence start to move during the second quarter, and that might be related to the uncertainty caused by the tariffs. So in addition to what we proposed about the macro policy responses just now, I think another factor to look at, obviously, is what happens to the trade negotiation. If we see like a quicker resolution, or at least an agreement on the tariffs, you might actually take some of the uncertainties away from the economy. So this is a very much a data-driven story, but our overall view is some additional support would be useful.
Maybe I could just add, I think it is very important again to differentiate the cyclical support that you need right now, and then the measures that you have to put in place to ultimately increase your potential output in the future. I think the previous package, 2008, only focused on the short-term part. And maybe that is part of the problem, because it then led to a misallocation of resources, and over time, potentially even had an adverse implication on China's growth potential. I think everybody's very much aware of that today. And as a matter of fact, China actually wants to move away from the old growth model to a new growth model. And so abstracting from the external shock, the support should only facilitate that transition, but not preempt it. So I think the biggest concern that many counterparts in the Chinese government have is that if we just relax policy too much, then we're just going to reflate the housing market. But that is not really what we intend to do either. So only enough support to manage expectations, help with confidence in the economy, while at the same time putting forward structural reforms and articulate them clearly, that ultimately lets you move toward this new growth model. Of course, you have to deal with the external shocks at the same time. The next question comes from friend Wang. Do you want to raise them?
Yeah, hi. Thank you very much. I was just curious about the call for expanding personal income tax base. I just wonder whether that would affect households' willingness to spend, because that will reduce their after-tax net income. If that happens, how should the government offset the impact to facilitate the shift toward a consumption-driven economy? And my second question is also with regards to your proposal to shift some more social core functions to the central level? Because we know that the central government already transfers almost the entirety of its income from the general public budget to local governments every year. So I'd assume that reassigning more social functions to the central level may require the central government to increase borrowing. So how much room do you see the central government still has to increase borrowing every year, say, in the coming decade? Thank you.
Yeah, let me start out maybe answering the questions, and then also ask my colleague Christine Wong to jump in here. Of course, when an economy is in a weaker position, talking about a tax reform, causes a lot of commotions. But I think in the Chinese context, where only 10% or even less than that pay a personal income tax, you can imagine that there is quite a bit of room to raise taxes for a certain segment of the society that probably their marginal propensity to consume is relatively low in the first place, while still protecting the ones that have lower levels of income. So it is the distributional part. I think there's a lot that can be done. And we know from other countries' experiences, the key thing is to articulate your policies clearly so that you can instill confidence. On the transfer part, I mean, here, as I highlighted, there are two things to it. One, to have the central government take on responsibilities that in most countries are done by the central government. But that secondly, again, when you take on more responsibilities and you're already transferring all your transfers to local governments, you ultimately also have to raise revenues, and of course look at your expenditures and see what you can do. I think we have a lot of experience in how to do this in a way that is least disruptive from a cyclical point of view. When it comes to spending, there might even be some cuts in spending that can be growth enhancing as opposed to undermining growth. But I'll let Christine Wong maybe come in and just say a word.
Can you hear me? Okay. On the issue of how central government would finance the expenditures, you're right. The central government already transfers all of its revenues to local governments through transfers, and that has been true since 2020. And the central government is partly financing its expenditures through deficits, debt raising. And that's happened in 2020, 2021, and so on. And that will, and as Alfred pointed out earlier, the central government's balance sheet looks excellent. So there is room in the short term for the central government to borrow more to finance these services properly. I think the problem with leaving it at the local government level is that some local governments are not providing these services. And that would be true, especially in the poor regions. So it's better for the central government to take on these responsibilities as it's done in other countries. Let me stop there.
Thank you. Fran, was that okay?
Yeah. If you have a numeric estimate of how big it is, that would be great, but that's fine. I know that it's hard to estimate.
Thank you. Yeah, and again, we'll come out with a paper shortly that spells out more details on this particular issue. Then I have Borson.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Very well, thank you.
Thank you for such a fantastic set of remarks and discussion. Very informative, much appreciated. So my question builds on Professor Huang's observation that China's growth might very well be a sectoral story at its core. And so to that end, I'm very curious about the panel's perspective on what sectors might be the primary source of that engine going forward. And just in case that answer might differ, depending on if we look at it from the current set of policy and current economic development versus if we look at it from more of an optimal economic growth model design perspective, so to speak. In that case, I would be very curious about both. Thanks very much.
Maybe I'll give a go first. I mean, I do not try to predict exactly which sector will do well going forward. The point I'm trying to make is the economy is obviously moving into the new stage of development. The cost base is higher, the population is aging, the external environment is also changing. So the growth model has to change, and the new sectors will need to emerge for growth to continue. We've been talking about lots of new industries in China. AI is something everybody talks about. High-end manufacturing is also a very important part of the story. To some extent, I think obviously the new sectors emerge. Sometimes it's a result of both government and the corporate sector activities, like the EVs, like the new energy sectors, and so on. But sometimes you don't know how it actually happened, like a DeepSeek. I mean, obviously the government was trying very hard also to push, to promote the AI development, but I didn't really think AI was planned by somebody specifically in the government. So a more important way to look at, and this was why I mentioned about the change of local government behavior. Combination of government and the private sector efforts are very important, but we probably need to make sure that the government does mainly providing infrastructure, maintain a good market environment, sometimes providing the industrial policy, but the majority of the roles should be left to the private sector. A final point is, I do think there is a need for a much bigger service sector going forward, because both for employment purpose and for consumption purpose, the service sector will need to play a much bigger role going forward. I'll stop here.
Very good. I actually wanted to ask everybody to identify themselves. So maybe both of you could just say who you are.
I don't think. Oh, I just got unmuted. Yeah, thanks for the opportunity, Alfred. So my name is Bosun. I work at the University of Virginia. I used to spend a decade at the Fed. That was actually based on recommendation that Guo Kai made way back when I was graduating from my UVA PhD program. Very much appreciate the effort. It's really amazing and informative. Thanks very much. And Professor Huang's answer, especially the emphasis on the service sector, is also resonates extremely well with me.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stefan Latouche. Maybe you could also identify yourself.
You hear me?
Yes.
Good. So I'm Stéphane Latouche. I'm the representative of Banque de France, Central Bank of France for APAC region based in Singapore. Thank you so much for the presentation analysis. It's so informative. I had two questions that you raised, more long-term issues. One is about to know your analysis and possible recommendation. One is about the misallocation of savings and its consequences in terms of excess industrial capacity. And another one that you raised, Alfred, I think is about the total productivity factor, which has been decreasing, as it is in Europe, by the way. And if I may, I have a very last point. It's about the possibility for the central bank to go to negative interest rates, given the situation of deflation, as did the ECB, for example. Thank you.
Who wants to come in first? Kai, did you want to get part of the answer, or Yiping? I see that you moved. Who wants to go first?
I can go with the misallocation of resources and the TFP. I do think that we need to make sure that the market plays a bigger roles in allocating resources. This was also why I mentioned earlier on the local government behavior now needs to change from direct big involvement in economic activities, probably take a step back to become more like a public service or goods provider. And that's, I think, would be very, very useful. And you look at, for instance, the overcapacity. That's it's the result of a complicated process. On the one hand, for instance, the new energy sector, it's been very successful in China, doing very well. Most of them were privately owned enterprises. But I also think some local government subsidies also played a bigger role, and that's and unfortunately, most local government helped to expand the production capacity without necessarily improving the technology or productivity of the industry. And so to a certain extent, that added to the problem of the overcapacity. That's why I think the idea that the local government changes the behavior, rationalize its industrial policy would be very useful, and hopefully would also help to ease the pressure on the capacity. The other side of the story, as Alfred mentioned earlier, is really needed to boost the consumption, and I'm not going to spend more time on that. But overall, I think if the industry is doing well, we do need to expand the domestic demand in order to balance the demand supply relation in the domestic market.
Kai, did you want to talk about the negative interest rate?
You're asking Guokai, right? He used to make monetary policy.
What do you want me to say, Alfred?
Well, I think there was a question about negative interest rates, whether that could be
an option. No, you know, I think there is a limit to monetary policy. I do favor lowering current rates a bit more given the low inflation environment, but you also have to be mindful of very low interest on banks, on financial stability, and the very perverse incentives that might arise when interest really go to negative. I think PBOC have more tools to use other than negative interest rates. I think they can, you know, they have those kind of quasi fiscal type of structural monetary policy tools. I think it could be used to do some of the easy. It's like QE type of stuff, even more targeted towards kind of some type of spending. That mean we PBOC did that once during 2015-16. That's the PSL lending towards those shanty town renovation programs. I mean, they can try to do something similar, but probably negative interest probably is a step too far in my view. Thank you.
And maybe I could take the opportunity, since we did not highlight it that much, but Jason, did you want to come in and just talk a little bit about on the NIMs in the banking sector?
Yeah, so currently we're sitting at the lowest ever NIM the Chinese banks ever been on, and historically you've had a managed relationship between liability yields and asset yields, and that started to really break apart during COVID, where asset yields fell much more sharply than liability yields because you saw mortgage rates cut dramatically. They almost halved in 18 months. SME loans under the 2 increases policy saw their rates go down again by over half. So you had this huge downward pressure on asset yields without a commensurate decrease in liability yields. Now that's stopped actually this past year, where NIM compression has largely halted. It's stuck at about 1.51%. which I think is too low for an economy growing as quickly as China. But it has stabilized, and you are seeing the will to really cut deposit rates in a way that matters.
Thank you, Jason. Bernard, did you want to come in?
Are you able to hear me? Hello.
Very well.
Thank you. I really enjoyed this comprehensive and informative panel, and it helped us to understand the current issues and things that we need to do, and the depth is really amazing. I want to think of the following. China is still an economy in transition, in my opinion. Some of the past successful institutions or arrangements has run out of its usefulness. At the same time, some of the past institutions arrangements could be even more important nowadays. Based on this, I want to ask a question about the functional efficiency of the capital market and make it sharper. Is there a zombie lending question, some zombie lending problem in China? By the same token, China is now trying to say, I push to let the sector push more to SMEs. Has the Chinese capital market created more upward mobility for the society, for business? In the past, it did by doing what they did, but now continuing with what they do, they cannot. So zombie lending, and actually through the SME, do they raise the upward mobility? The second question is that past success in China thrive on allowing policy innovation at the local level. Nowadays, my feeling is that policy compliance is more important than policy innovation. So locations by locations, they are not to take experiment, and they would rather just showcase that they are complying with the central policy's direction. And that is not helpful for an economy that I think is still in a state of upward transition. So I want to hear your opinion.
Bernard, can you just identify yourself as well?
Sorry?
No, just introduce yourself.
Hi. My name is Bernard Yang. I'm at NUS, the business school, retired as a professor, and at EAI, and also ABF-Yale, and I am a visiting professor at Changjiang, visiting professor at SCHIPKE.
Thank you very much. Maybe I'll take the part on the zombie lending. I think that is probably one of the most important part to ensure that resources go to the more productive part of the economy. In principle, resolve or the exit strategies for companies small and large still a big weakness of China. When you look at, for example, the bankruptcy laws in China and the execution of it, that's a big issue. And there are a number of recommendations that one can do, of course, to strengthen bankruptcy procedures, whether they're out of court or in court procedures, but having better exit strategies is important. But of course, you want to do that in a way that is socially acceptable. And I think the problem is there is often still the assumption of an implicit guarantee. And breaking that is, of course, not easy. When people think that ultimately everybody gets bailed out, when you break that, that creates a lot of uncertainty. So yes, and I think, as I mentioned, the loan moratorium that is still ongoing, I think the lending to some of the SMEs, there is probably part of that is because you don't want to let these institutions fail. But doing that in a socially acceptable fashion is critical. Maybe we'll pass on. I think we're running a little bit out of time, but I have two more that maybe we can get in. Andrew, if everybody agrees, we might run a little bit over time. Andrew Fennell, maybe you can introduce yourself as well.
Hi, hello, everybody. My name is Andrew Fennell. I'm with Citi here in Singapore. And thank you very much for this very informative webinar. I just had one quick question. I was just pulled up some of China's latest price indicators. And, you know, the GDP deflator has been negative for 2 years now. And both core and headlight CPI seem to be trending towards, you know, quite subdued levels. So my question for the group here is, you know, what is the optimal policy solution in your view to resolve these ongoing deflationary pressures? And then would the suggested fiscal package that has been proposed here be sufficient? Or do you think there are broader policy measures that need to be considered? And I guess just to wrap up here, I mean, in line with Guokai's comments in his closing remarks, I do wonder whether near-term counter-cyclical policies will suffice, or whether the authorities need to take sort of a deeper look at some of these industrial policies and other structural reforms that have been alluded to in today's webinar. So that's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you. Kai, I think you're ready to go.
I'll try a bit. You know, we three never discussed this among ourselves, so we three may have different views on this. My sense is that you know, there need to be, if you really want to pull the economy out of this very low inflation environment, you probably need to do a few things at the same time. You want a quite big macro package that could boost short-term demand, particularly towards consumption. In that sense, I think you need both fiscal and monetary, and we discussed at length already. Two, I think you need some kind of a market clearing process that to allow some capacity to exit, so that you know, there is massive imbalances between supply and demand within China in certain sectors. I think that market clearing has to happen to get rid of some of the capacity. Three, I think it's become increasingly apparent and important. There need to be some medium-term roadmap for structural reforms. So the society, the business, and everybody have a clear idea where the country will be heading towards in the next 5 to 10 years, and how they're going to plan accordingly. I think the fiscal reform is of paramount importance, as Alfred already elaborated. But there need to be a set of structural reform measures to set the medium-term expectation. I think if you do all three of them, short-term macro package, allow some market clearing, and a medium-term roadmap, and robust reforms, you know, I think we still have decent chance of doing well in the medium term. I'll stop here, and I'll see what Alfred and Yiping have in their mind.
Well, Yiping, do you want to come in?
I very much agree with Guokai's analysis. My way of looking at low inflation problem, there are two kind of theories or framework I adopt or look at. Number one is the so-called quantity of money theory, and the other is output gap problem. In the current situation, I tend to lean toward more on the output gap problem, i.e. demand supply misalignment. And I think just looking at the quantity of money problem would not, or a solution would not be able to completely eliminate the problem, i.e. easing monetary policy is useful, but easing might not be sufficient. And the question, I think, is if demand is weaker than supply, we still need to fix the problem. So I think overall, what Guokai recommended sounds like a meaningful package to me.
Thank you very much. And I think we have one final question. I'm very happy that up until now, we haven't talked about tariffs and external shocks, and that was very much in line with our objective as well to discuss, China's domestic issues and how it changes from one growth model to another. But we do have one question now from Hong Yu. Do you want to go ahead? Maybe identify yourself. I think I don't know whether we have lost him but maybe I'll just read the question.
Hello?
One question.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, please.
Hi, sorry,
Yes.
Alfred. Yeah, so my name is Yu Hong. I'm affiliated with the East Asian Institute. Firstly, I really enjoyed today's very informative the policy briefing. I learned a lot, actually. I have questions as indicated by Alfred on the trade front. So the US President Trump already sent a few rounds of the tariff letter to many ASEAN countries, with tariff rate, ranging from 20% to 40%, likely to taking effect from the 1st of August. So my question is, how will this US Trump's tariff policy on ASEAN country will affect the China and ASEAN trade and investment ties in the long run? Given the fact that ASEAN already become China's largest trading partner, right? Roughly accounting for, I think, 40% of China, the total trade portfolio. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Maybe I could start out by just highlighting that that's part of the uncertainty that we started talking about at the very beginning. It is not only the question about how the negotiations between China and the US evolve. Ultimately, it also depends on the kind of agreements that other countries here in the region and more globally have with the United States, not only in terms of tariffs, but also content requirements and other things that could have an immediate impact for China. So all of that is currently uncertain. I think that adds to the lack of confidence that people have, and hopefully we're coming out of this. But then it's the fine print, and we haven't really seen anything so far. We don't even know what has been agreed between the UK and the US in terms of issues related to content requirement and other things. Ultimately, whatever happens on the trade side will have implications on the investment side, because investments, whether it's relocation of supply chains or greenfield investment, are somewhat related. Kai, did you or Yiping, do you want to come in?
Yes, it's uncertain, but I have quite strong view on this. I think China's integration with the Southeast Asia ASEAN supply chain will continue to deepen no matter what. There are a few bigger trends, I think, behind that. China accounts for 35% of global manufacturing capacity, but only accounts for somewhere around 15% of global consumption. So capacity is much more than China's share of consumption. So some of that capacity will need to be more balanced. So it has to move out somewhere. I think Southeast Asia, ASEAN countries will be the most natural destination. Two, I think even if there are higher tariffs towards those transshipment, I think it actually will force Chinese firms to take an even longer term view on how they are doing their business in Southeast Asia. Now some of them probably is there only because of tariff. So they import from China, then do something in ASEAN, then export to other markets. If there are higher tariffs towards those kind of stuff, then they need to really become local. They need to invest in their local capacity to be embedded in local communities and to play for the long run. And they eventually produce most of their value added in the local markets. Then to meet those country of origin requirements, and also actually become a good citizen of their local economy. So I see those broad trends actually will not be disrupted in any way that however US is doing. Actually, those uncertainties, I guess, will speed up those kind of long-term engagement of China and ASEAN economies. I'll stop here.
Maybe from my side, just one comment. Everything, of course, also hinges upon China's own continued opening up, reduction of tariff and non-tariff areas vis-a-vis the region. I think one thing is very clear, that we have now about 350 million people that are more or less middle class in China, that as consumption demand increases would provide a strong impetus for trade relationships between ASEAN and maybe the European Union as well in China. So again, I think this move toward more consumption combined with a further reduction in any kind of trade barriers could provide an opportunity where part of the trade could now be with China, and you would have a division of labor where maybe on the higher end value add part, China would export, and middle to lower would be toward China. Yiping, did you want to have a word, and then I'll let Bo maybe ask. Bo, do you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, I think it's a very important question. However, the uncertainty remains here because we still don't know a very stabilized kind of trade policy situation in the near future. For the moment, as US has claimed that they have made the 3 trade deals, including the one with China, but it indeed is a framework. And also, we see a few letters coming out, including to some kind of Southeast Asian nations, which specify that the tariff rates would be vary from 30 to 40%. Let's say if the current China-US trade kind of tariff level can be lowered, like the fentanyl kind of tariff can be lowered after negotiation, whereby China would face a kind of a 30% or above kind of a tariff in the future, like this. You use this as a kind of a benchmark for the long run, then the difference of the tariffs between China and ASEAN nations would be actually remain about the same as before, like a 10% to 15% kind of a tariff difference, whereas Vietnam and other Southeast Asian nations may have a sort of lower tariff. So in this case, then I don't see a big kind of a incentive change for the production chain relocation, and therefore I don't see a big change in terms of the intermediate goods kind of a supply between China and ASEAN, and then to the States. On the other hand, for the final products, it is interesting because the overall tariff levels that US imposed towards the whole rest of the world actually increased significantly. That means the final products, no matter from China or from ASEAN, have to face a higher tariff rates, where as a result, all these countries would have to supply less to the States. So if this is the case, then I would expect there will be some minor kind of or modest kind of a decline in terms of the joint work with the final or consumption goods to the US. So this part of the supply chain might be affected. So these are my 2 takeaways. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we have come to the end of our session. We've actually run a little bit over time. Apologies on this. But let me thank you first for those who joined us today for the questions. Again, our hope is that we can do this on a more regular basis. Most importantly, my partners, Professor Huang Yiping, Dr. Gurkai, National School of Development, and CF40 Institute. Thank you for doing this together with us. And thank you very much, Christine Wong, Jason Bedford, and Bo Chen for joining us as well. So thank you very much, and wish you all a good day.